For years, the world watched Russia take pride in its legions of steel, parading power and discipline before the Kremlin. But in 2025, amid the ruins of Pokrovsk, that iron empire turned to dust. 170,000 soldiers were thrown into battle with promises of victory, and found only ambushes, drones, and death. What Moscow called an offensive became an open-air graveyard, where every meter of advance cost hundreds of lives. Today, you'll see how Putin's obsession with Pokrovsk became his most costly mistake since the beginning of the war. What began as Russia's largest offensive since Bakhmut soon revealed the true cost of arrogance. Pokrovsk didn't become a trophy, it became a trap. The operation, named the Summer Offensive, had a simple goal: to break through Ukrainian lines through sheer saturation. With no clear tactical gains, the Kremlin reverted to the most brutal and primitive tactic of modern warfare, the so-called meat grinder. Waves of infantry pushed forward across open fields, often without armored cover, just to expose enemy positions that would be struck minutes later by artillery. The result? Entire columns wiped out before even crossing the line of contact. Satellite images show kilometers of terrain littered with wreckage, charred T-72 tanks and BMPs lying side by side with bodies left behind. Each Russian advance cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives to capture positions that Ukraine would retake just days later. Captured documents from the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, reveal the scale of this disaster. Between January and September of 2025, 87,000 Russian soldiers were killed, 160,000 were wounded, and 34,000 simply disappeared, many buried beneath craters left by their own artillery. In total, nearly a quarter of all forces sent to Pokrovsk were lost. Even so, Moscow insists on calling it a controlled advance. In Western intelligence reports, the term is different: gradual annihilation. For every meter of territory gained, Russia pays with 100 bodies, and the worst part is that the command seems to consider that acceptable. But the real blow to Moscow was still to come, because while the Russians bled for every hill, Ukraine was preparing something invisible, silent, and devastating. While Moscow celebrated a few meters of advance and thousands of dead, something was quietly moving south of Pokrovsk. That night, Russian radars detected nothing but static noise. But beneath that electronic silence, Ukraine was preparing one of the boldest operations of the war, the offensive led by its military intelligence service, the HEUR. The mission began near Dobropilya, about 20 kilometers from the front line. The idea was simple but risky: to break the Russian siege of Pokrovsk by retaking 3 strategic villages that controlled the supply routes. But this was no ordinary infantry operation. It was planned and commanded directly by Kirillo Budanov, the head of the HUR, known for his surgical strikes and for never appearing in the same place twice. On the night before the attack, dozens of FPV drones flew over the region. They didn't strike. They mapped every radio antenna, every parked vehicle, every camouflaged trench. The data was processed in real time and sent to airborne groups composed of reconnaissance units and special forces. The operation was named Volya, meaning freedom. At 3:17 in the morning, the first Mi-8 helicopters cut through the sky with no navigation lights. On board were 46 HUR operators and 80 paratroopers from the 79th Air Assault Brigade. Their objective? Capture Kucheriv Yar before dawn, the highest point in the area, used by the Russians as an observation and artillery base. When the first Ukrainian platoon touched down, the village was already on fire. The Russians had used white phosphorus to slow the advance, turning the streets into a maze of smoke and flames. Even so, the paratroopers pushed forward in small groups, clearing house by house under drone coverage that streamed live footage directly to Budanov. The operation wasn't just meant to win, it was meant to prove that Ukraine could still surprise. As the fighting raged, civilians hiding in basements began to be evacuated, many showing signs of burns and starvation. Drone footage captured rare scenes: groups of Russian soldiers raising white flags and walking unarmed toward Ukrainian lines. There were 52 confirmed surrenders in less than 2 hours. At 6:42 in the morning, the Ukrainian flag was raised over the roof of a destroyed school, the same one the Russians had been using as an improvised headquarters. The video, shared by Budanov himself through a secure channel, went viral within minutes. The message was clear: Pokrovsk was not lost yet. The victory at Kucheriv Yar had an immediate effect. With the hills reclaimed, Ukrainian observers were able to adjust artillery fire on Russian supply routes to the north. In less than 48 hours, Zatishok and Suketsky were also liberated. Satellite images showed what had seemed impossible just weeks earlier: Russian lines retreating in disarray, abandoning vehicles and intact ammunition depots. A map on the screen would show the progression: blue arrows pushing back the red, the siege breaking, the city breathing again. Ukrainian morale soared. In Pokrovsk, civilians began emerging from shelters, and supply convoys resumed movement for the first time in months. Budanov described the operation as a reminder that intelligence and precision are worth more than numbers. And for the first time in months, the word victory reappeared in Ukrainian military reports. But how would Russia react to such a symbolic defeat? The answer came quickly, and with even more brutality, because when the Kremlin loses ground, it responds with what it does best: fire, drones, and vengeance. After the lightning victory in Kucheriv Yar, the battlefield changed its face. Pokrovsk was no longer a siege. It became a tactical laboratory where Ukraine combined drones, intelligence, and precision to turn numerical disadvantage into a new form of warfare. In the skies over Donetsk, the hum of drones replaced the roar of tank engines. Ukraine transformed what were once reconnaissance tools into multi-purpose weapons. FPV drones, equipped with Voji grenades and anti-armor warheads, now strike directly at convoys, machine gun nests, and even artillery shelters. Others, smaller and quieter, serve only to track and isolate Russian pockets, guiding artillery fire with surgical precision. Footage shows Russian columns trying to regroup, only to be hunted down one by swarms of FPV drones. These machines, cheap and almost disposable, cost on average just $700, but destroy tanks worth $3 million. And the impact goes far beyond physical destruction. Russian soldiers now fear the sound of those engines. For many, the buzz of a drone means death is only seconds away. On the ground, precision comes from elite units. The Shiur, with its deep infiltration operations, and the Azov Battalion, specialized in urban combat, have become the backbone of Ukraine's counteroffensives. These teams operate in small groups, often fewer than 10 fighters, but with concentrated firepower and near-perfect coordination with the drones. Their modus operandi is simple and deadly: identify, strike, and vanish before the enemy can react. While Russian artillery is still calculating coordinates, the Ukrainians are already kilometers away, ready to hit again somewhere else. This agility destroys the logic of the Russian army, a heavy, centralized, and slow system. But the true masterstroke lies in tactical deception. Ukraine began allowing controlled advances. Small Russian groups were deliberately permitted to move a few kilometers forward, believing they had broken through the defensive line. But every step was part of a larger design. Once these groups moved too far from their rear, drones cut their communications and special forces struck from the flanks. Within minutes, what seemed like an advance turned into an invisible encirclement. This tactic demoralized entire units. Russian commanders, pressured by Moscow to show results, ordered new pushes and repeated the same mistake. Each attempt ended the same way: isolation, encirclement, and destruction. But even in the face of battlefield collapse and catastrophic losses, Moscow still hasn't pulled back. Because, for the Kremlin, giving up Pokrovsk isn't just a military defeat, it's a political humiliation. And that's why, even as casualties keep mounting, Russia continues sending more men into the same slaughterhouse. Right now, the force ratio in the region stands at 8 Russian soldiers for every Ukrainian. More than 170,000 troops, divided across 3 fronts, surround the Pokrovsk sector, the largest Russian concentration since the start of the war. But numbers alone don't win battles. Most of these troops are recruits with just weeks of training, rushed to the front to replace losses the Kremlin doesn't even acknowledge publicly. Intercepted communications from the HUR show a clear pattern. Battalions are rebuilt under new names, but with the same fate: to be destroyed again. For Ukraine, this has created an unexpected advantage. Every time Moscow launches a new assault, the enemy arrives less prepared and more predictable. Still, the numerical imbalance forces Kyiv to match every soldier with technology, precision, and intelligence, asymmetric warfare in its purest form. Even so, Russian forces managed to enter the city limits. Satellite images and verified videos confirm small groups operating in industrial areas on Pokrovsk's eastern side. President Volodymyr Zelensky himself publicly acknowledged the situation, but with an important caveat. The presence of Russian troops in Pokrovsk does not mean the city is about to fall. What Moscow calls a conquest is, in reality, a vulnerable pocket, surrounded by crossfire and constant surveillance from Ukrainian drones. Every Russian movement inside the city is tracked, every position mapped, and every attempt to send reinforcements ends with columns destroyed before even reaching the urban zone. What Russia calls a foothold is, in truth, a minefield disguised as a trap. Even if the Kremlin somehow manages, at an unimaginable cost, to capture Pokrovsk, the outcome can hardly be called a victory. With over 250,000 casualties, hundreds of armored vehicles lost, and supply lines stretched to the breaking point, Russia faces a paradox. Every meter gained in Pokrovsk weakens its chances on every other front. Generals call it a Pyrrhic victory, when the cost of winning is so high that it becomes indistinguishable from defeat. And that's exactly what may be happening now. While Moscow exhausts itself trying to seize a ruined city, Ukraine gains time, intelligence, and ground elsewhere. Pokrovsk may yet fall, but if it does, it will take with it what remains of Russia's offensive capability in 2025. And it's precisely this irony, winning and losing at the same time, that defines the current stage of the war. But what happens when propaganda can no longer hide the bodies? Pokrovsk is no longer just a city. It's a symbol. On one side, the brute force of an empire obsessed with reviving the past. On the other, the innovation, courage, and resilience of a people who have learned to fight against the impossible. The battle for Pokrovsk is a microcosm of this war. Russian brute force against Ukrainian intelligence and resilience. Each day, Ukraine defies expectations, but the tide of Russian soldiers doesn't stop. The fall of Pokrovsk would indeed be a heavy blow, but the price Russia is paying may mark the beginning of its own downfall. The only question that remains is, how long can Ukraine hold on? And how much more blood is Putin willing to spill for his obsession? And while the Kremlin bleeds in Pokrovsk, another front is taking shape, silent but far more dangerous. Click now on the video beside this one and see how the United States and its allies are building an invisible wall of missiles that is surrounding China before the first battle even begins.